Looks like YouTube is up and running. We've got our Zoom audience here. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm just going to wait one more half minute or so for those that are going to join. It's just hitting the top of the hour now. Okay, welcome to the Friday webinar, everyone. I'm Derek Leger, the Executive Director of Conservatory Canada. This is our Friday teacher webinars that we hold usually 2 or 3 weeks out of every 4 now. As we go through things, last week I met with a lot of you and we looked through the Mosaics 4 book, which you may be able to see behind me on the piano there. And next Friday, I'm going to read through the second part of that. Last week, I read through the Baroque and classical repertoire that we've published. And next week, next Friday, I'll go through the modern selections and the romantic selections in the second half of the book so that you can see what's in there. Those are now available from Deborah Wanless Music if you want to pick them up. And we've published the prep grade 1, 2, 3, and 4 albums, and we're currently working on 5, and we hope to have that ready by the end of March at the very latest. So that's what you're going to hear in terms of webinars from me for next Friday. Then we're going to take a couple of weeks off, and we'll be back at the end of February with a nice session with Elaine Keeler from Ottawa, who's going to talk to us about some really interesting things in the Mosaic series from her forte piano. So watch your inbox. I'll start hitting you with emails again next week about these sessions so you know what's coming up. And then today we continue our series here with Dr. Erin Parkes from the Lotus Center in Ottawa. And she's talking to us in this series about students with exceptionalities. And I'd encourage you to check out her first 2 sessions that are on the CCTV YouTube channel. And today, Erin, we're talking about ADHD. And so I'm going to turn this over to you. And I know you've got a presentation here lined up. And as you all know, those of you that have seen Erin's presentation before, she's very organized. She's open to questions anytime. Just put your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A, and I'll moderate those to answer as we see fit whenever Erin wants to stop and answer those. So Erin, thanks for joining us again. It's great to see you here. Happy New Year. And I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Derek. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I'm always happy to be here for these webinars. And I do, really encourage questions like Derek said. So at the end, if you have any questions about your own teaching or students, I'm happy to stick around as long as is needed to answer those. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about supportive strategies for teaching students with ADHD. And I know that all of us have students with ADHD for sure. And there are really, really wonderful things about teaching students with ADHD, but there can also be challenging things. We're going to talk about both today. And so just a quick note, at the top of the webinar. And if you've seen the other webinars, then you've kind of seen this as well. But there are different ways of talking about working with students with exceptionalities or with that population. There is sort of a focus on what we call the medical model, where we're focusing on deficits basically, because that's what a diagnosis always is just a list of deficits. And then there are different models like the social model where we're looking at that person is just a member of society and seeing any challenges as not inherent in the person, but as part of the systems that are around them. So I always usually talk in a kind of a combination of the two. So I will be talking a little bit about the diagnostic criteria so that that's all clear. I think it gives us a good idea of who the students are that we're working with. And, it helps us when we have students come in that say they have a diagnosis of ADHD. We kind of know what it is to start with, and we'll have some strategies that we can apply right off the bat. But also looking at ways in which our students are creative and wonderful and can do a lot. It's our teaching that can change to accommodate them. So you will see a little bit of both in the webinar today. So what is ADD or ADHD? And I will say I put both sort of acronyms here, attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, because we often know both and talk about both, but really now it's kind of shifted so everything is under the ADHD umbrella. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll be referring to ADHD, but we'll look in the next slide at what that all looks like, and you'll see that there's not always the H part in there. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder or a neurotype characterized by difficulties with organization and sustained attention, among others. So this is sort of the overall definition that's usually given, but there's a lot more to it that we'll talk about today. What's important to take away from that definition is the fact that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder or condition. It's not a choice. It's not, a lot of what we see in students with ADHD is just the way their brain is wired. So everything we talk about today, the challenges with organization and sustained attention, the differences with sensory processing, the sort of impulse control issues and emotional regulation issues that we can sometimes see are not willful and can't necessarily be just changed. It's something that we need to work with because it's part of their neurodevelopmental makeup. It impacts approximately 9% of children and 5% of adults. And it never completely goes away. So if there are 9% of children with it, you may ask, well, how are there only 5% of adults? Part of it is that there are increased diagnoses now. So a lot of the increase in diagnoses in the last, 15 years, they're not all yet in adulthood. So we don't have the numbers that have kept up. Sometimes, though, you do see these symptoms sort of start to be managed as somebody gets older and don't necessarily meet the diagnostic criteria for ADHD anymore. Not that they, can't or don't. And actually, I think every time I've given a webinar or a workshop or some sort of training like this for teachers, somebody says to me after, I think I have ADHD. And I've had a lot that have then gone on and been tested and found that they do, especially when I'm doing like more intensive training and we're really talking about what ADHD is. So there are definitely lots of adults as well, and more of sort of these diagnoses later in life. So it never really goes away, but strategies can definitely be learned. And so you'll even see a big difference between 5-year-old students with ADHD, which can be very challenging, and 17-year-old students with ADHD who have been in school and have had to learn some strategies. I know I see a huge difference even between like 13 and 16, like when they start high school and have to really learn more strategies. There can be a big difference there. So it can be primarily inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive, or combined. So let's go over a little bit what that looks like. So here are the symptoms of ADHD. So the inattention part, so the students that have the hyperactivity part have all of it. But then there are students that we would previously have said were just under the ADD banner, so don't have the H part, that don't have that hyperactivity green band. So even though we call it all ADHD now, there are still kids and adults that don't have the hyperactivity part. The hyperactivity part too is kind of what tends to fade a little bit as people get older. But the inattention part is what kind of sticks around. So for the inattention, often has a hard time paying attention, doesn't seem to listen, is easily distracted, can be careless with details, frequently does not follow through on instructions, is disorganized, frequently loses things, often forgets things, and frequently avoids doing things. These are all sort of what we call executive function. I'm not going through them in a lot of detail now because I will talk about executive function in a lot of detail and all of these things. But just to go over now sort of the diagnostic criteria. Hyperactivity piece is in constant motion as if driven by a motor, cannot stay seated, frequently squirms and fidgets or talks too much, often runs, jumps, and climbs when they're not supposed to, and cannot play quietly. Most of this is in the sensory piece. I'm going to talk about that a lot too. We're not going to talk about it in detail now. And impulsivity, so frequently acts and speaks without thinking, does things like run into the street without checking for traffic, has difficulty taking turns, can't wait for things, often calls out answers before the question is complete, and frequently interrupts others. This part can be really challenging for teachers because the behaviors can be quite disruptive, right? And it can be quite frustrating to be like blunt about it. I think it is important here to just really frame it for ourselves that this is part of their neurological makeup, and they just don't have the filter that jumps in and stops them from doing those things. So when another student wants to ask a question, and knows to wait until you're done speaking, these students don't have that. Okay, stop and wait, and she'll stop speaking, and then it's your turn. That just doesn't jump in for them. So again, these are things that they can mature with, but if you have a younger student, younger than 10, especially, they just don't have that yet. So you just have to kind of learn to work around it, because it's just the way that they're going to be. Now, this I know is very dense. I don't expect you to be able to read all of this. I'll hit on some of the main points here. But what's really important about this is it's the ADHD iceberg and really shows what's happening underneath the surface with ADHD because it's a lot. So at the top there, the tip of the iceberg is again really like the diagnostic criteria. So I'm not going to go through it again now, but basically everything that we just saw on the previous slide is up there. But below that is, stuff beyond the diagnostic criteria, but that we know is common for people with ADHD. This is true with every diagnosis. So previously, I did a webinar on autism. There's the diagnostic criteria for autism, but then there are so many things that we know are there for autistic students, like sensory issues and stuff like that, that is not, we think of autism as like a social communication condition, and it is, but there's so much more. We think of ADHD as the hyperactivity and the inattention, and it is, but there's so much more. So one big thing that I think is important is the first thing that they have there on the below the surface. It says neurotransmitter deficits impact behavior. Insufficient levels of neurotransmitters, dopamine and norepinephrine, result in reduced brain activity. So what that really means is the reward centers of the brain for people with ADHD need more of a hit. So their brain is not creating enough like dopamine to the same extent as typically developing people. And this is seen very clearly and demonstrated in the literature and in research. So when we see students with ADHD, for example, playing a lot of video games, because there's been this sort of controversial thought that like video games causes ADHD. It's the reverse. So kids with ADHD like to play video games often because it gives so much like hits of dopamine. It's so like constant. There's so much going on. Every like step that you take, every success that you have in a video game and like gives you a hit of dopamine, and they need that many hits to feel that reward of the dopamine. So a lot of the sort of engagement in those kinds of behaviors is that's what's happening. I'm not saying that we should encourage kids with ADHD to play tons of video games because there are challenges that come from that as well. They can get overstimulated, all of these different things. But just to understand that that's like part of where it comes from, or at least that's one big theory. Some of what they have here is just the stuff that we already kind of will be talking about, their executive function issues like working memory and recall, task initiation, stuff like that. It also talks about sleep disturbance. So it says 56% of people with ADHD have sleep disturbance, which, I mean, we know how much that can impact behavior. I mean, all of us have not slept well and then been kind of grumpy probably the next day. And if you're feeling grumpy and you don't have the social filter to hold in all the ways that your grumpiness could, express itself, then you're going to act grumpy. So sometimes we see that with our students. They're kind of irritable. And because of their irritability, they're acting out in inappropriate ways. This can be part of that culprit combined with the impulsivity. Um, so not learning easily from rewards and punishment, it can be difficult to give them a consequence and then them learn from that. Um, it can be difficult for them to follow rules. Again, this is not really willful. There are a whole lot of different theories on why that is, but part of it is kind of impulse control issue again, that they want to do something and that they don't stop and think, wait a minute, I know what will happen if I do this. I don't want that thing to happen, therefore I'm not going to do it. That whole thought process doesn't happen. It's just, I want to do this, there, I've done it. And then, whoops, I shouldn't have done that, comes later. So that's important to know as well. Coexisting conditions, this is so important. 34% of people with ADHD also have anxiety. 29% also have depression. 12% also have bipolar disorder. Um, and then it goes through others, 11% for Tourette syndrome, 4% obsessive compulsive disorder. So there's a lot with which it correlates. They don't talk about autism here, but it's less that people with ADHD have autism and more that people with autism are very likely to have ADHD as well. Anxiety can hugely impact learning. And I talked about that more in one of my previous webinars on neurodivergence as well. It's very prevalent in kids with all kinds of neurodivergence and can impact learning in so many ways. I'm not going to get into a lot now, but that can be a real issue that we see with students with ADHD. It does talk about oppositional defiant disorder here, and it says 54 to 67% of people with ADHD have ODD as well. I'm just gonna say a little word about ODD because um, it's a bit of a concern of mine when kids are given that label, and because you can see how much it overlaps with ADHD. My concern is that what is happening is these ADHD-like behaviors are being seen as oppositional and defiant, which sort of gives the impression that it's willful. It's not. It's not willful. So I just always give that caution around oppositional defiant disorder. There's starting to be less buy-in into it in the professional community. So it's just important to be aware of that. Again, when you get a student that has that diagnosis, it can give you an idea of what you're going to see. What I want you to always think about with any student you ever have is what's going on underneath it. If they are demonstrating defiant behavior, why? What's causing it? Is it an impulse control issue? Is it an emotional regulation issue? Did they not sleep well? Are they having a lot of anxiety? Defiant behaviors often come from anxiety. There's something underneath it. And I think when we just see kids as exhibiting defiant behavior, we react very negatively. So that's my little spiel on oppositional defiant disorder. Most of the rest of what's here is really executive function issues. They talk about low frustration tolerance, but that's also sort of part of executive function. But I think this piece is important too. And the reason that I'm kind of focusing on these emotional pieces is because I think that that's where teachers sometimes struggle the most. Well, I don't just think that, I know that, and that's also really demonstrated in the literature that teachers struggle most with students with behaviors more than with learning challenges. Not that that's not important too, and we will talk about that as well. But it's really important to know that some of these challenges, like it says, you know, may give up more easily, loses their temper, short fuse. These things are all part of the ADHD. So the two primary considerations are unique sensory processing and executive function. So everything from now on that I talk about is going to focus on those two sort of larger issues. So for unique sensory processing, I always talk about this concept, the optimal zone of arousal. It's a really, really important concept to understand. It's used a lot in occupational therapy, and I became aware of it when I started doing this work with students with exceptionalities and was working with an occupational therapist to just sort of build my toolbox and make sure I knew what I was doing with these kids. And this really changed my teaching and my approach with these students. So the zone of optimal arousal, also called the window of tolerance, so it's that green band in the middle, is when we are at our best. So when we would say we're like in the zone. So we're focused, we feel good, we're being productive, um, we're getting the right amount of stimulation that we need to be really like on. And this zone of optimal arousal is different for all of us. So if you're a person that needs to go work in a busy cafe with a lot going on around you, then your window is pretty high. You need a lot of stimulation to be in your zone. If you are like me and I cannot tolerate that at all. I need it to be really, really quiet and everything low key. Yours is just lower down. So you just need less stimulation to be in your zone. And so, like, we all have that. We also all have different, um, you know, sizes to our zone. So it can be that we have a really wide zone, and my husband's like that. It doesn't matter what's going on, he's fine. He can function anyway. Like some of us are like that. It takes a lot to get, outside of the zone. There's some the zone is narrower and you really need the environment to be controlled. Um, so for you to be kind of on. If you're at either end, there can be difficulties. So at the top of the zone, if you become overstimulated, then you go into hyperarousal. So this is where if it's gone really too far, this is where we see fight or flight responses, or what we would call a meltdown, particularly in autistic students. We see that a lot. So then you're really not, you don't have rational thought at that moment. You're in fight or flight. So most of your brain is not working. It's just, at the back of the brain that is just survival mode. So this is where we can see students really being defiant or even like aggressive sometimes. And that's just because there's been too much stimulation. This can also be mental stimulation. So it can be that it's just your brain is working overtime. So it can either be that your nervous system is taking in too much sensory information and it just starts like spinning and it gets too much to process, or it can be really trying to concentrate and, like too much coming in too fast and not able to process, and you go into hyperarousal. It can also go the other way into hypoarousal, where you're not getting enough sensory stimulation. For most of us, our nervous systems work for us to try to keep us in that optimal zone. So, for example, if you're a person, especially that needs a lot of stimulation, like when you were in school and you were in lectures or whatever, you maybe would doodle or something like that, like, or swing on your chair. Like, we all know kids that swing on their chairs. It makes me so nervous, but some of them do it. We're all just trying to give ourselves the stimulation that we need to get back into our zone. That's what we're doing. And most of the time we're doing it unconsciously, but that's what we're doing. If you are feeling really overwhelmed, like, I don't know, if you teach a group class and it's all boys, I've had classes like that, and it's just like a lot. And you feel after like, oh, I just need to sit and have a cup of tea or whatever it is to, unwind a little bit. You're just trying to get yourself back down. So our nervous systems are all doing this all the time to keep us in whatever our zone is. This can be different in people with ADHD in a couple of different ways. And I'll start by saying too that we can be hyper or hyposensitive to any of our any of our senses. So taste, touch, smell, like the big five that we know. Also the vestibular sense, which is like movement. So kids that are rocking on their chairs or really like swings are hyposensitive in their vestibular sense. So they need a lot of that stimulation to feel that they have enough of it. And so that they'll seek that out because they can't be in their zone unless they're getting a lot of that stimulation. What we see with people with ADHD is there are differences, but it's not necessarily a specific difference. There can be specific differences with different profiles, though. So studies show that people with ADHD are likely to have differences that are reflected in both hyper and hyposensitivity for some. So they can get overstimulated or they really need more stimulation. What we really know about them is they're less able to adapt to an uncomfortable sensory situation. And this can be part of that like emotional regulation. Like it doesn't feel good for any of us to be in a sensory situation that we don't like, to be either getting too much or too little. But most of us have that filter to be like, I don't like this, but I'm not going to freak out. Some of these kids, they're like, I don't like this, I'm going to freak out. And then that's what happens. So when we see kids with hyposensitivity, so they need more stimulation to be in the optimal zone. This is often part of the H, the hyperactivity part of ADHD. So sometimes that hyperactivity, that constant movement, that seeking out stimulation, that like running all over your studio and banging on the drums or whatever they're doing, banging the piano when you're trying to tell them something or whatever, is just their nervous system telling them that that's what they need to be in their optimal zone. And that's where the H, the hyperactivity comes from, is this like, I need more, 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 more. So they're moving all the time, they're talking all the time. All of that is giving them stimulation. So again, it's like, it's hard to deal with. But they're just acting the way their nervous system is telling them to act. So there are things that we can do that we'll talk about, but it's important when we're seeing our students act like that to understand this is what they're doing. Their nervous system is telling them, how can I meet this need? And this is where the sort of medical model versus like a social model comes in. It's not just they're doing this and it's wrong and it's not the way students are supposed to act, but okay, that's what their body is telling them they need. How can I do that with them? And it might be different than the way I would normally teach. I came from a very traditional teaching background, conservatory, scale, sight reading, ear training, repertoire. I'm a pretty like calm and structured person, so it worked for me. It took me a lot of work to learn to teach differently to meet the needs of these students. And then hypersensitivity, so they need less stimulation to be in their optimal zone. This can be part of what we see when we have students that have difficulty staying focused. And so things like a lot of clutter or a lot of stuff on the walls and that kind of thing. The reason that all of that is distracting for students with ADHD is because their mind doesn't filter what's important and what's not. So when there's all of this going on, there are interesting things or whatever, their brain is not shutting it off to focus on you or playing or whatever it is they're supposed to focus on. They can't filter like that. Everything is coming at them. And it's the same for sensory stimulation. Everything is coming at them. And so it just feels like a bombardment and they're not able to filter out. Now for some, that's good. Those that are hyposensitive, that's what they want. They don't want to filter anything. They want it all coming in. But for those that don't have the hyperactivity piece so much, um, it can just be a lot. And so they're likely to become hyper aroused. So here are some strategies that we can use to support sensory needs. So really observe your student to understand their sensory profile. So do you see sensory seeking or sensory avoidant behaviors? And things like sometimes when we see things like refusing to play their music or like even like more outward behaviors like throwing their music book or something, those can be results of that hyperarousal too. Um, think of yourself when you feel hyperaroused, like when you have been around too much noise or too much stimulation, and you're like, if anybody touches me, I'm going to lose it. When you feel like that, those are the kinds of things that you would do, right? So try to connect with that feeling and understand that that might be what your student is experiencing. Incorporate kinesthetic learning as much as possible. If you see a student that is sensory seeking, move, get them to move, get them to do body percussion, get them to use percussion instruments, get them to play loud and fast things, let them bang the piano and incorporate it into an improvisation, maybe get up and like roll out like a big staff mat on the ground and get them to crawl around putting things on it. As much like movement as you can work in, like the more the better for those students. But it should be purposeful and it can be purposeful. So if you are working on reading notes on the staff, instead of doing desk work or something like that, just use the staff mat on the ground. Um, if you're working on rhythm, instead of just clapping the rhythm, get up and like bounce and do body percussion and that kind of thing is just a lot more. Just be aware of the sort of kinesthetic input of all the things that you're asking your student to do. Because where we start to get into trouble is when we're not giving the student enough stimulation, and then they're just going to seek it out on their own, and it might not work with what you want them to do. We want to give them that stimulation so they don't start seeking it out in maladaptive ways. You can also use sensory supports like a wiggle seat. So that's what's in the picture there. I like using wiggle seats because they're pretty non-disruptive and it's easy to use like on a piano bench or something. Or if you're doing like floor work, sitting on the floor, they can sit on that. If you're doing desk work, they can sit on it. It's squishy, it has little spikes on it, super easy to incorporate. Or noise canceling headphones if they need it. I know it might seem like, how can you use noise canceling headphones in a music class? I have kids that can hear better than I would ever thought. I have one autistic student in particular that uses noise canceling headphones and uses the mute pedal and can still hear things. So it's okay. Give it a try. If you have a student that is really sensitive. And especially if you're working in a multi-studio work environment where there might be, people in a waiting room or all kinds of different noise happening. Includes activities that have high sensory input balanced by low sensory activities. So you can use accompaniment or backing tracks are really, really great. Again, for those students that are sensory seeking, instead of just playing on the piano, if there is a backing track, depending on like a method book you might be using or whatever, put that on and let them play with it. It's just giving more stimulation. Every bit of stimulation counts. Using percussion instruments provides both strong auditory stimulation, but also touch. There's the vibration and all of that. Movement activities, we've already talked about a little bit. And music with a strong or a fast beat. I find doing like speed drills too, really, really popular with these kids. Also using a metronome is always a little bit like always a little bit uncertain with the metronome because some kids, we all know, some kids really hate the metronome. But I find some kids with ADHD really like it because it's really, really strong structured beat. And then to do something like clap a rhythm, start it at 80 beats per minute, then go up by 10, then up by 10, then up by 10, then up by 10. It's like a speed game. And it's almost like a video game in terms of like you reach one level, then another, then another, then another, in terms of that like dopamine hit, right? So that's something, that kind of thing. It doesn't need to be a rhythm with a metronome, but those sorts of like leveled games that you can do are really great. I don't find you need stickers or anything like that. Just do it. That's good enough. And allow breaks if you're doing, I say rehearsals, but lessons too, can be overstimulating. So they can be like a signal or just being able to say it. Like, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. Can I have a break? It's great to foster that. One way that I sort of do foster that is I'm very open with my students about what I'm seeing in them. So if I see they get overwhelmed, I say, I see that you're getting overwhelmed right now. Do you want to take a break? Sometimes they're not identifying it themselves yet. And I'm like, sometimes we're the first one that's identified that for them. Or like, I see that you need to move right now. Why don't we like get up and move and identify it for them using language to identify? I see what's happening. I think it's X. Here's a solution that we can use for X. And encourage them to tell you, or they can just give you a signal sometimes because sometimes they don't like to say out loud what it is. It can be like a card that you can have on top of the piano that they can hold up. Sometimes that's easier for kids than asking for help or saying what they need. Always, though, I make these breaks purposeful. It's not like I'm like, great, here's a book, go sit in the beanbag chair for 3 minutes and then you can come back. It is like, okay, you need a break from playing this piece because you're getting too frustrated or whatever. Let's go work on the rhythm of it, like somewhere else, or work on something else, and we'll come back to it. Or finding a compromise, like, okay, well, I see you're getting frustrated. Let's just do these 8 bars, and then we'll move on to something else. It might mean that you're having to change your goals a little bit at that time. But that's okay. What they're capable of in the moment is what they're capable of in the moment, right? And you have to work with that. So now executive function, which is the other big piece here. So executive function is the brain's CEO, and it all happens right at the front of your brain. And so the way your brain works is like a chain. So every part needs to be working well, and it kind of goes up like in a very sort of simplistic terms from like survival basically and basic functions like breathing, heart beating, and everything up to, more sensory processing, then emotional processing, and then executive function, which is higher level thought, like organizing, making decisions, prioritizing things, that kind of thing. It's really, if you look at the diagnostic criteria, the primary issue for people with ADHD. So when they talk about being disorganized, having a lack of, attention, task perseverance, all of that stuff, it's executive function. It can be a common challenge in a lot of diagnoses too. And so I'm just saying that because this will be applicable to a lot. So you can take it in and think about other students. So students that are autistic, with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, with learning disability, lots of things, executive function can often be a challenge. So what is executive function? So there are 6 here. Sometimes they're broken up into 7, sometimes there are 8, but I'm working with this one today. So number 1 is organizing, prioritizing, and activating to work. And so sometimes that activating to work or task initiation is put on its own. Um, but so it's really about, okay, I have a task. What do I need to do to break down this task to meet the goals that I have? This is a huge thing that we do in learning music, right? Okay, I want you to go home and work on this piece. Or even I want you to work on this piece and you start with 8 bars first, and then once you're comfortable with that, move on to, the next 4 bars or whatever it is. So first of all, you need to break it down. You can never just say, go home and work on this piece. It really needs to be broken down. But then even that can seem like a lot, like work on these 8 bars. Well, what do I work on first? What am I supposed to be working on? Am I just playing the notes? And, that's why sometimes we, um, have students that maybe didn't do what we asked them, but it's because they kind of got frozen or paralyzed by not quite knowing what to do. Number two, focusing a sustained attention or shifting your attention to the task. So you might see when you have a student with ADHD that you're doing an activity with them, and then it's like, great, that's done. Now let's go to the piano and play this piece. And they have a really hard time making that shift or that transition. So that's pretty common, especially if you're going from a preferred to a non-preferred activity, which totally makes sense. None of us want to go from a preferred to a non-preferred activity. But for these students in particular, it can be really, really challenging to do that. So here too, um, sort of bargaining with our students a little bit, I think is an approach that works. Like, okay, we're going to spend 2 minutes on this activity, and then we're going to go to the piano, and they understand that they get to spend 2 minutes on this preferred activity, but then they are going to have to move over, and you can hold them to that. Like, that's your agreement. That's what they're going to do. It might be challenging for them, but knowing ahead of time, this is what you're going to have to shift your attention to can really help. Regulating alert lists, sustaining their effort, and processing speed. The sustaining effort is the big piece here. That sustained focus and attention or sustained effort can be really challenging. And this is when I was saying that they can get hyper aroused from this. It's because it can be like so mentally taxing for them to sustain that effort. And we're often asking our students to do this, or we do it when we're practicing, right? And it's hard. And especially when it's a non-preferred activity, like go home and practice all these scales. Well, who wants to do that? And so especially if you have a hard time sustaining your effort and your focus on these things, it's going to be really difficult to follow through. So sometimes when we're teaching these students, we do need to adjust our expectations in the lesson a little bit. So instead of saying, we're going to work on this whole piece, now let's do it again and work on articulation. Okay, now let's work on pedal. It's like, we're just going to do that with the first, 2 lines or whatever it is. Like, work on what you need to for them to understand the concept and be able to go home and work on it, but don't expect the sustained effort in the class, especially when it's something new that you're working on. And also adjust your expectations for when they go home and practice. Managing frustration and modulating emotions or emotional regulation. So this is where we see the sort of blow ups or explosions or really defiant types of behavior. So again, here it's all about being proactive. So if you know that your student is prone to this and that you want to really look at, when does that happen? Is it when I'm asking them to shift from a preferred to a non-preferred activity? Is it when I'm asking them to give me a sustained effort on something? Is it just anytime something is challenging for them? So again, it's always like there's a behavior, but the problem is that what's causing the behavior. The behavior is not the problem. It's whatever is causing it. So that's what we need to figure out, and that's what we need to address. So if it was that anytime that they're confronted with something that they see as too challenging, there's this sort of blow up, then the way that you introduce these more challenging concepts needs to be softened somehow. Maybe it's that you break it down more and give little pieces that you know they can manage and then sort of build up. Whatever the issue might be, it's just important to remember when we see these frustration or emotional regulation issues, something is causing it. And what's causing it is a normal emotion. So, okay, they're frustrated with a new concept that is difficult for them. Well, we all get frustrated when something is difficult for us, but we're able to modulate our emotions. They're less able to. So it kind of overflows. Working memory. and accessing recall. So this comes up a lot in, for example, like a key signature or something like that. If there's like pedal and it just says simile and you're supposed to remember the pedal all the way through, that kind of thing can be difficult. So this can be just as simple as write in all the sharps or flats or write in the pedaling, that kind of thing. Self-monitoring is a really important piece to learning music. So self-monitoring is being able to look at what we're doing and assess if we're doing what we think we should be doing. We do this constantly in music. So, okay, go back and work on the staccatos, make sure your staccatos are really crisp. And then you play and you're assessing, okay, were they? Did I play the staccatos the way that I wanted to play them? And if you're like, no, I didn't, then you can go back and try something different. For a lot of our students with ADHD, that whole process is not happening. And even if you want it to happen and you remind them, it's really difficult for them. So this is something that really needs some work in the lessons. So it's really important for you to practicing with them. But also a strategy that can work here is you playing and making mistakes and have them identify it in you, because sometimes they can't identify it in themselves. And then working on them identifying it in themselves. And I find that even just doing that process a couple of times, they start to get it like, oh, that's what I should be doing. Because this is when you see students that come back and it seems like they didn't practice at all. And they're like, I did practice, I practiced every day. It's often because they went home and they didn't do this self-monitoring part. So all they did was keep playing and playing and playing and not stopping and fixing anything. And it's because of this piece. So it's important to recognize that sometimes when they say they practice all the time, they did, and they were doing their best, even if it doesn't seem like it, but also that you need to really work on that with them. So some strategies to support executive function. Use very explicit written instructions. And I mean, very explicit, really, really clear. And it can really also help to use a recording. So either just an audio recording of what you want them to do. And again, in that audio recording, I would play it incorrectly and then play it correctly so that they can hear the difference, so they really understand, or it can be a video recording as well. And like having the written instructions and a video or audio recording, I find is really the best. With the written instructions, it's great to have a checklist where they have to really be purposeful about, did I do this? Yes, I did, and check it off. They may not be fully doing it the way that you want them to do it or expected to, but you can see their effort and they're more mindful of their effort. Reduce distractions in the environment. So like I was saying, things on the walls, things on shelves. I use baskets for everything. Like my shelves are full of baskets because the more that's out there, first of all, they have a hard time filtering that out. And second, if they have difficulty not acting on impulse and they see something cool, they're gonna just go for it. Support working memory through visual aids. We just talked about that. Strategic seating, if you happen to be teaching in a group environment, having the student sitting close to you or, in an area in the classroom where there are less distractions. Practice practicing. This is probably the most important thing. Don't ever send your student with ADHD home with instructions that you haven't done in the lesson. Every single thing you're going to want them to do at home, you need to practice in the lesson. And like I said, it could be not that you're doing the whole piece, but you're doing it with a smaller portion. But you need to practice and make sure that they understand what they're supposed to do. And they need to try it because it will help their own recall of what they're supposed to do. And this is where a recording really helps too. Like they've done it, you've written it down for them, they have the recording, they can link all of those things. Change activities or teaching modality as often as needed to sustain attention. So sometimes I have teacher or like when I do these kinds of workshops, sorry, my dog is barking. I don't know if you can hear him, but I'll just keep going. Often I have teachers say, well, I change activities every 5 minutes or whatever. You really don't need to do that like a full change, but you can be working on, let's say, a repertoire piece, and you can work on it for 15 minutes, but I wouldn't suggest just sitting at the piano for 15 minutes and working on it. If you want to pull out a rhythm, for example, and work on that, go somewhere else and do body percussion. If you want to work on a certain finger pattern, go to the desk and make it a speed drill. Like pull all these pieces out, actually go to a different place in your space, like not just at the piano, and then bring it all back to the piano and working on your repertoire. So that's how you're changing activities. You can keep working on the thing you want to work on, but that can be the way that you can be hitting on all of those things that you want to address. Support their emotional needs by reducing frustration and practicing empathy. And I know that the behaviors are really frustrating for us as teachers, and I don't want to take away from that. It is. But I always try to remind myself that this is not my student just being difficult. It's the way that they're wired, and we can work on that with them. We can have clear boundaries. We can say what's okay and what's not okay. But what we really want to do is try to reduce the frustration that's leading to those behaviors. Trying to control the sensory environment that's leading to those behaviors. And then when that hasn't happened and they're getting upset, being for them, there for them and showing them empathy, and then moving forward. It's amazing how much relationship building can happen in those difficult moments. Some of the students that I've been closest with and have stuck with me the longest, really, I think it's more to do with this relationship than it is music. I've had some kids that I don't think are even that into piano, honestly, to be, blunt, but they stick around, I think, because of the relationship. And then they're still learning something, but it's so valuable to be able to be there for them in that way, because sometimes they're really coming up against some negativity in other learning environments. And helping them to organize their materials. You might see the kids with ADHD come in with their stuff like kind of all over the place. If you're giving them a lot of sheet music, it's like all scrunched up or whatever. Just helping them to set that out in a way that is organized can help a lot. And so some behavior support, I've also already talked about a lot of this. So we talked about where the behavior can come from: impulse control, emotional regulation, executive function, and sensory issues. We want to control the environment and control that for them as much as possible. Meeting behaviors with empathy, always remembering that the behaviors are coming from a natural emotion. The student just doesn't have the processes to express that in an adaptive way. So provide clear expectations and boundaries, but make sure that you're placing your expectations at the ability of the student. Their ability is the whole package. So if they're a student that you think is capable of a lot, but in the moment their frustration tolerance is not allowing them to do what you know that they can do in terms of their music learning, the frustration tolerance is part of it. They can't do it that day because of their frustration tolerance. Even if that was magically gone, they could totally do it. It's not magically gone. So we need to make sure that we're setting up our expectations, looking at the whole person. Now, some ADHD strengths. So I've talked a lot about challenges and how to approach them in a positive way, but some strengths too. They're really great holistic learners. They can like take it all together and process it. Typically, these are all sort of typical. It's not everybody, obviously. So you don't always need to break down the pieces as much as is typical when it comes to their learning and their processing. For how they're going to practice, yes, you do. But for how they're going to take it in, like for example, if you're trying to teach something that's like pitch and rhythm based, they can kind of learn it all together. Usually they don't need to necessarily break them out. They have really quick information processing. I've had so many kids with ADHD that are so quick at figuring things out, and part of the neurodivergence is they think differently. They think outside of the box. They have different ways of figuring things out. So we can focus on different ways of getting the information through to them too. They tend to be very immersive and it's really important with students with ADHD to create engagement with them through something that they know. And then they'll kind of throw their whole selves into it. So if you can if you want to work on improv, it can be on like a video game song that they know and are excited about. Video games have super cool music, so that's something you can work with. If they are really imaginative, you can create a story to go with the music, and that will get them really engaged. We already talked about speed drills. So if you've worked with kids with ADHD, you've seen how like quick they are. So there are so many ways to engage that for them. So if you provide these sort of supports and these sort of solutions for them with the sensory piece and the executive function piece, and you play into these strengths by letting them be immersive, finding ways that you can use what interests them, storytelling, whatever, to bolster their learning, you can have a lot of success with students with ADHD. So that's it for my presentation. I'll take some questions now, but also if you have, other questions, I'm always happy to field emails anytime. And we also have more courses at the Lotus Institute for Professional Development. There is a mini course on ADHD, which goes a lot more depth into it. We have webinars and mini courses on all kinds of things. I just started a certification course, or it's been around for years, but we just started a new cohort of a certification in adaptive music education. So feel free to check out the website and see if there's anything there that would support you in your teaching too.
Thanks so much, Erin. Can you just elaborate maybe for a moment on those certification online courses to give people a feeling for how they're run in case they're interested in taking those on?
Yeah, so the certification is 3 levels of 10-week courses. They're fairly intensive courses. So every week is about 3 hours of material and some readings. That's all done asynchronously online. And then we have a 1 hour Zoom discussion call every week where everybody is doing the course. We usually have we have 6 people right now, and that's pretty typical. We all get together and ask any questions that came up in that week's lesson, or just share experiences we're having with our students or questions. And it's great to have a lot of teachers give their input. Over the 3 levels of the course, it's really like everything we've learned at Lotus Center or in my own research. I'm also a professor at the University of Ottawa, so do a lot of work in this area. So it's really if you want to like dig deep in adaptive music education, because we cover really everything through those 3 levels.
Wonderful. So we'll turn to some questions here now from the chat box. First one, when a student fidgets, like fast bouncing with their knees and legs, do they need that outlet, or do we try to ignore it or acknowledge it and find a way to help them stop, even if it only lasts a moment?
So fidgeting, it's the same with autistic students. We see fidgeting a lot. This is a place where they're doing that because they need movement. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with it in itself. But if we can meet their need for movement in other ways, then that's good. Because I mean, I don't want to say fidgeting is like really disruptive. It's not, but it is holding back what you want to do with them a little bit, right? So if you instead got them to do body percussion at that moment, then they wouldn't need to fidget. They would be doing something with their body. So that's sort of like the more proactive approach to that. But other than that, like if you're in the moment and they're already fidgeting, if you can pivot to doing something, then that's great. So I would acknowledge it maybe, but not try to get them to stop. Try to see if they want to do something else. Like I said, I think it's great to acknowledge these things, to say to the student, oh, I see that you need to move. Why don't we get up and do this? Because it tells them that you're seeing them, like you're paying attention and you understand, and you're not mad at them because they're fidgeting, because sometimes probably people get mad at them, that you're seeing what's happening for them and you want to find a solution for them. So even those little moments can be really great, can be really impactful for them. So don't stop it, but try to find another outlet.
And so someone's asking as a follow-up, should we give them a fidget toy or something while we talk to prevent them from playing on the keys or running around?
So you can, as long as there are really clear boundaries around the fidget toys. Um, because I do find sometimes then it can be a distraction for students, even if they know it's there, right? Like they sometimes will perseverate on the fidget toy when it's not time to use the fidget toy, but they know it's in the basket or something like that. I prefer to give them functional movement. But if you have a student that can totally use a fidget toy and they're going to be fine to put it away, then absolutely you can use a fidget toy. I always give that word of caution around fidget toys.
Right. Anybody else, if you have questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat box here, or you can use the raise your hand feature. We can bring you on live to talk with Erin directly. What advice do you have to help a student that struggles with every new concept?
So I think that it depends on the reason that they're struggling. So if they're struggling because of anxiety, which I find it often is because of anxiety, even if we're not seeing that way, then some of the things that we've talked about, like giving them much smaller bits, either instead of like going fully into the concept a few weeks before, you've done little pieces to prepare them. And then when you get to it, they've done it now for a number of weeks, and once you're introducing it in a piece, it's not so daunting. Or maybe it's just, instead of doing a full thing, you do it, you know I don't know, if it's like, let's say you're working on moving from solid chords to broken chords or something like that, and they're really into, like, just anxious because they've never done that. Instead of working on like a whole series of them, like we might do like a 1, 4, 5 chord and they practice doing them all or something, just doing one for a week, that's all you do. And for like 3 weeks, that's all you do. It's just a C major chord broken, and then you can slowly add. If it's not anxiety, but they're not understanding the concepts or something like that, which is not typical of ADHD, but because ADHD can often co-occur with learning disabilities, we can see that. And sometimes we don't know all the diagnoses our students have. Sometimes the parents don't know all the diagnoses, right? They haven't figured it out. Well, especially when there's these co-occurring diagnoses, they can think like, oh, I've got it, it's ADHD, when really there's something else going on. Then there are maybe other solutions that you might need to find, depending on what the issue. Oh yeah, I see. Yeah, anxiety. Um, yeah. So I don't know if you think that have you tried, if you've tried like breaking it down, really breaking it down, and there's still these meltdowns, which sometimes can happen. Like we do everything we can, and it still bubbles over. Sometimes that's the case. I mean, we do all of these things, really break it down, give weeks and weeks to work on something new. Try to introduce it by the time you get to it, almost like it's not something new anymore when it's actually introduced into a piece. But sometimes I've had students, yeah, so if it's a younger student, especially, he might just not have the tools yet. So like when I have a student like that and I'm doing everything I can to support him, and he's still really struggling with that emotional regulation, especially younger kids, they might just not be there yet with that emotional regulation, and have so much anxiety that anything new presented in any kind of way it provokes their anxiety, and they don't have the tools to not have that bubble over. It might just be the way that it is. So having preferred activities that you can kind of pivot to for the moment, or also just depending on the student, they may not be able to do this, but having really, really small goals that they know that's all they need to do. Like, okay, we're just going to play these 3 notes. That's all. And then we're going to go on to this. It still might take a lot of coaxing for them. It's also, I find to be just a trust thing often with younger students, especially that they need to know that you're giving them goals that you think they can achieve. And I'm very open. I tend to be very open with my students about these things. I'll say to them, I would never ask you to do this if I didn't know you could do it. And but just saying that to them once doesn't necessarily convince you. They need to see that you really aren't ever giving them anything. And that means you might be giving them a little less than you know they could do, because you need to establish for them that they can trust you. But that takes some time. But you can start doing that with your student and they still may be reacting, and it will take some time for them to get used to your boundaries and the way you're asking them to do them and to trust you. It can sometimes be I was just going to say, it can sometimes be like a slow process because you do feel like you're really slowing things down, but that's okay. I mean, ultimately, they're going to get further because they're going to stick with it than if they burn out, or they crash and burn and then they stop. So it's okay to go slow.
I think we're going to cut the YouTube stream off here. I sense there's some in the audience here who want to ask questions off camera. And so anyone watching on replay, thanks for joining us today, for watching the presentation. Feel free to reach out to Erin. We thank her for making that availability there, so that if you have questions, if you didn't catch your address, feel free to email me and I can pass